Okay, good morning everyone. So, welcome to another term of history. In this term, we are looking at the events that allowed Hitler to become the leader of Germany, unleashing a chain of events that led to the Second World War. Now, today, however, we need to set the stage before we start looking more closely at Germany. We're going to look back at the effects of the 1929 economic crisis, also known as the Great Depression. You might know it from what you studied in English class. In particular, we'll tackle the following points: the Great Depression, the United States, how they reacted, how Britain and France reacted, how Italy, Japan and Germany reacted, and finally I'm going to read you a model answer. A model answer to the question, the Great Depression did not have a significant influence on international relations. How much do you agree with this statement? Spoiler, you should not agree, because it had a huge impact. Now, before we start, we need, of course, to explain what was the Great Depression and how it could have affected international relations. To put it very simply, the Great Depression was an unprecedented economic crisis that was triggered by the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in October 1929. Since America was at the center of the global capitalist economy of the 1920s, the crisis spread from there to the entire world. We all have heard the expression economic crisis, but we should really think about what it means for people like us, normal people. So here you got a picture that explains it pretty well. So when the stock exchange collapses, people lose their jobs. If people lose their jobs, they don't have income and they cannot buy things. If they cannot buy things, stores go out of business because they have fewer customers. If they go out of business, they do not order from factories or from other producers. If factories do not get orders, factories produce less and therefore more people lose their job, and here you go with an economic depression cycle. Keep in mind that is what might happen in the next few years, or not, if the governments around the world do their job well, which I am cautiously optimistic about. Now, let's talk about the United States. Sorry, got the formatting of the transcript is a bit... Okay. Now, the US were the first country to be hit by the Depression. The impact was huge and caused millions to become unemployed. It also caused a panic among American banks, which in the previous decades had been lending money to governments and companies all over the world. All of a sudden, these banks wanted the money back because, of course, there was an economic crisis and you lent money and you want them back. And the fact that they wanted the money back contributed to spreading the depression to other countries. We will see that more in detail when looking at Germany. Politically, the depression made the US even more isolationist. What does isolationist mean? We studied in the previous lessons. It means when a country just wants to deal with itself. It doesn't want to deal with the rest of the world, and the Americans have it very strongly. Now, the US became even more isolationist, as we said. Before the crisis, the United States was already barely willing to participate into international politics. Now that fixing the economy had become the main priority of the American government, the US were even more reluctant to join collective actions. For example, they did not agree to participate to the economic sanctions against Japan in 1931 because they were afraid that the sanctions would hurt the American economy even more. Let's move on to Britain and France. Something similar happened to these two countries. As you remember, Britain and France were the two main leaders of the League of Nations, which we have studied in depth in the last term. The League did not have an army, so its main weapon to solve international issues were economic sanctions. They would refuse to sell or buy from certain countries that broke international law. This is what an economic sanction is, and is a weapon that is still used today against countries that do not do certain things that our countries might like them to do. For example, we got economic sanctions against Iran because they're trying to build a nuclear weaponry. We got sanctions against Russia because they essentially invaded the Ukraine 6 years ago already. So this is how economic sanctions work. you refuse to buy or sell certain items to certain countries, okay, that break international law, hoping that this would convince them to respect the decisions, in that case, of the League of Nations. However, like the United States, now the main worry of the British and the French governments was to save the local economy, save the economies of France and of Britain, and preventing people from becoming poorer in their countries. Because if they stop trading with certain countries, if they stop selling stuff to Japan or to Italy in 1935, this meant that the British and French factories that were producing those things would stop working, that people would lose jobs, making the depression cycle mentioned earlier even worse. This, of course, had the effect of making the League of Nations look weaker, because for these reasons, Britain and France did not support strong actions against countries that broke international law, such as Japan in 1931 or Germany in 34 and 35, or as we said, Italy. Speaking of Italy, this man here is Benito Mussolini, and he was the fascist dictator of the boot-shaped country we all know and love. Now, Italy was already a relatively poor country by European standards at the time, and the Depression made things worse for much of the people. Mussolini reacted by allowing the government to take ownership of several major industries and banks, reinforcing his control over the Italian state and the economy. Mussolini also wanted to distract the population from the growing poverty by trying to build an overseas colonial empire, leading to a more aggressive foreign policy, which culminated with the invasion of Ethiopia, which discussed before, in 1935 and 36. Overall, Mussolini's grip over Italy was reinforced by the Great Depression, unlike the power of the democratic governments of Britain, France, and especially Germany. Before we talk about Germany, we need to mention Japan. Now, Japan was also hit terribly hard by the Great Depression. Its economy relied heavily on trade with the US and with China, but the American and Chinese governments, in order to save their own economy after the Depression, had imposed a lot of taxes on goods coming from Japan. We don't want the silk that Japan sells, because we need Americans and Chinese producers to make silk. So, this was again to protect local industries. Is an attitude called protectionism, and we will probably see a lot of it in the next few years. Suddenly, in Japan, the essential commodities like rice, which were imported to Japan from China or from other countries, became much more difficult to afford, and the Japanese population was at risk of actual starvation because there was not enough food. This difficult situation was the ideal moment for the Japanese army in Korea, which, as you might remember, was essentially independent and doing its own thing, to start a campaign of conquest in Chinese Manchuria, which we've seen a couple of weeks ago as well. It was, as we said already, a fully illegal land grab, which went against everything the League of Nations stood for. But it was also made necessary from a Japanese point of view by the very dire economic situation brought by the Great Depression, which has caused, as we said, massive starvation among the population in Japan. And finally, let's come to Germany. Germany had come out of the war in 1919 as a broken country. It almost fell to civil war between nationalists and communists. You can see here some members of the German army and the German police, the Freikorps, which were groups of veterans from the German army who fought against the communist rebels in the major cities. That was this kind of low-intensity permanent civil war in Germany in the early 1920s. So it survived this sort of civil war between nationalists and communists. It barely survived another huge economic crisis in 1923. Remember, we mentioned that as well, when they were not able to pay for the war reparations because they were blamed for the war, and therefore France invaded one of their countries, and this created this huge downward spiral of economic decline. During the mid-20s, however, the German economy was growing again, and democracy in the country seemed safer from extremists. It was not threatened anymore by communists and nationalists. This miraculous economic recovery was also due to the Dawes Plan, a number of loans coming from American banks, and this is where the fact that American banks wanted their money back comes into play. German economy had been saved by this loan of something like $25 billion. It's a huge amount. It was a huge amount at the time, and it's still today. As we said, as soon as the Great Depression hit America, these banks wanted their $25 billion back, plunging the country back into the deepest economic crisis of its history so far. To simplify a very complex issue, in democracies, crisis breeds extremism. People who have fewer certainties in life and feel on the losing end of their economy will vote for political parties that make the most outrageous promises. Germany had lots of them. You had the communists to the left, who promised to abolish private property and turn the country into a workers' paradise, allegedly. And then on the right you had the Nazis, who promised to make Germany great again by destroying the Treaty of Versailles, by recreating a powerful German army, and by conquering the lands of those Slavic foreigners to the east in order to feed the growing German population. In 1933, 3.5 years later after the Great Depression, Adolf Hitler, leader of the German Nazi Party, was elected into power. The dominoes were in place and the road to World War II was now open. So, those were the facts. I will allow you to read the model answer by yourself. It's color-coded as always. The question is, the Great Depression did not have a significant influence on international relations. How much do you agree with this statement? So, looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.